Ascendai, the Destiny Crest. Audiobook by Robinson and Walsh. Chapter 10, Akio Kobayashi. Colt woke up bright and early the next morning, his spirits high in anticipation of his visitors. He decided not to go hunting that morning. Instead, he headed down to the lake to wash up and grab some of his stored meat from the ice hole he had made. After he cooked breakfast, he sat in the recliner and waited anxiously for his visitors to show. He had so many questions that ran through his mind as he debated over what he would ask first. I think I'll ask about the bright blue light, or maybe why he hunts vampires, or maybe I should ask him how he found out about their existence in the first place. Colt jumped out of the chair and began pacing back and forth through the small living room. Samson watched him from his place on the floor in front of the fireplace. The wolf suddenly lifted his head and looked alertly at the door. Colt felt a presence and turned to the door intently. "It must be Mr. Akio," he said to the wolf as he walked quickly to the door. He opened it and spotted Akio, followed by two teenage boys a few hundred yards away walking towards the cabin. The old man was dressed differently than the night before. The dark clothing he'd worn had been replaced with normal clothing any hiker in the area might wear. Colt was slightly disappointed. He had really liked the mysterious look Akio had when he was in the black uniform. Colt went out, excited to meet them, with Samson following close behind him. As he and the wolf drew near, he yelled out, "Good morning!" All three waved back with smiles on their faces. They met up a couple of minutes later. "Hey, Mr. Akio, how are you?" Colt asked the older man. "Fine, Colt. Thank you for asking," he answered politely. "I'd like you to meet a couple of my pupils." He placed his hand on the shoulder of the young man on his left and said, "This is Justin." He was a 16-year-old boy with dark brown eyes and brown curly hair that was cut short to his head. He had a stocky build and an open, friendly face. He hadn't stopped smiling once in the short time since they had met. Colt thought he must be a happy person. Colt reached out and shook his hand. "It's nice to meet you." Justin smiled and nodded his head in greeting. "And this," Akio said, patting the young man's shoulder on his right, "is Crimson." "Crimson," Colt said as he reached out to shake his hand. "Cool name." Crimson smiled. "Thanks. It's nice to meet you." Crimson, at 17, was a little taller than Justin with black hair, brown eyes, and an olive complexion. He was a little leaner than Justin and looked more guarded. There was a scar running down the right side of his face beside his eye. It ran all the way from his temple to the bottom of his cheekbone, and to Colt's eyes made him look very tough. "Shall we go inside?" Akio asked Colt. "Oh yeah, sorry," Colt said. "Come on in, Mr. Akio. I have a nice big fire going for you guys." They all headed to the small cabin and went inside. Colt took a seat in the recliner with Samson lying beside him on the floor, while the three visitors settled on the couch. "I thought there would be more of you," Colt said. "Yes, there should be," Akio answered. "I have two more pupils, but they are finishing up a little training exercise and will join us later." "Really? Cool," Colt said enthusiastically. "What kind of training?" Justin snickered. "Justin," Akio said firmly. Justin silenced himself immediately and straightened up on the couch. "What's so funny?" Colt asked suspiciously, knowing he was missing something. Akio breathed in deeply, then let it out slowly. He looked at Justin with disapproval and then turned back to Colt. "Last night my other two pupils were supposed to stay at camp while we hunted the vampire you encountered," Akio exclaimed. "Instead, they decided that they would try to sneak out to follow and observe us from a distance." "But Crimson caught them," Justin interrupted with another smirk. Crimson smiled as Akio looked back to Justin, silencing him with a glare. "They disobeyed," Akio said, sounding frustrated. "Oh, well, how come they didn't get to go with you?" Colt asked. "It is too dangerous for them. They are not ready yet." "I see. So they got in trouble and couldn't come today?" "No, they will be along shortly, but first they must complete their punishment." Akio noticed the concerned look that came over Colt's face when he mentioned punishment. "They are moving rocks around," Akio said with a small smile. Crimson and Justin chuckled. "Yeah, big ones," Justin said with a laugh as he glanced at his two companions. They both started laughing at Justin's obvious enjoyment of the missing pupil's punishment. "Well, hopefully they'll listen next time," Colt said, smiling at Akio. Akio smiled back and then cleared his throat. The room instantly fell silent. Colt thought Akio was a nice man, but he was also very intimidating and was obviously respected by both of his students. After a moment, Akio asked, "I'm sure you have several questions for us, and I have a few for you as well. So how about you ask me a question, then I can ask you one?" "That sounds fair," Colt said, nodding. Go ahead then, ask away. I have so many, Colt said as he thought it through a moment while Accio waited patiently. Okay, I got it, he said excitedly. What's the big deal with the bright blue light? Accio looked puzzled. What light? You know, the light in the vampire's head, the one that floated away when the vampire was killed. I don't understand, Accio said. Justin and Crimson looked at each other with puzzled expressions on their faces. Colt felt uncomfortable when he noticed their looks. I'm not crazy, he mumbled. There was a light, and when Samson roared it grew and froze the vampires. It was in pain. It stopped in its tracks. Yes, Accio said, choosing his words carefully so he wouldn't offend Colt further. I did notice that the roar seemed to cause the vampire pain, but it was a completely new experience for me. I'm not sure why we couldn't see the light. Okay, Colt said, feeling a little reassured. I wonder why only I could see it. I'm not sure, but I will look into it. Thanks. I guess it's your turn to ask me something. No, I didn't answer anything, Accio insisted. It's still your turn. Colt hesitated, trying to think of what he should ask. How about this, Accio suggested. Why don't I tell you my story? Then you can tell me yours. And if any of our questions don't get answered, we can discuss it later. That sounds great, Colt said, excited to learn about the mysterious old man. Accio stood and began pacing slowly around the room, gathering his thoughts. He bent down to pat the wolf on the head and then resumed his slow pacing. He stopped in front of the fireplace and cleared his throat, and the three young men leaned in, waiting breathlessly for the story to start. The year was 1947 in Japan, Accio began. I was 10 years old and my mother and I were living alone in a small town. My father had been killed in the bombing of Hiroshima. Japan was in upheaval. It was being occupied by foreigners for the first time in history. The emperor's powers had been dissolved, and needless to say, he wasn't very happy about it. My mother had always told me to be at home before nightfall. The area was very unsafe. I knew better than to be out after dark, but I was having too much fun with my friends and ignored my mother's warning. It was late, and I knew that I was in trouble, so I was running home as quickly as possible. I could see my house in the distance, and that's when I first felt it. The boys leaned in further. Felt what? Colt asked quietly. Evil. Pure evil. I'll never forget the terror that I felt. I knew that I was in danger, but I didn't know where the feeling was coming from. I was all alone. Well, at least I thought I was. I started running as fast as I could. I was almost to my front door, so close, when something hit me from behind and knocked me to the ground. I started screaming for help, but no one answered. I didn't know it at the time, but I was about to see a vampire for the first time. Much like you, Accio said, looking at Colt. I thought they were just creatures from scary stories. I wish that they were, he said, sadness apparent in his voice. What happened next? Colt asked in a hushed tone. The terrifying creature was standing over me. He could have easily killed me at any time, but he seemed to enjoy tossing me around as I screamed for my mother to come and save me. I'll never forget his face. It still haunts my dreams. I've been hunting vampires for years, and I have killed my fair share, but I'll never come across another vampire like him. What do you mean? Colt asked, looking confused. Most vampires consider themselves godlike. They dress, act, and speak sophisticated. I suspect that it's their attempt to hide the inner beast. This particular vampire, however, was filthy. He was wearing old, worn-out clothes and wasn't wearing any shoes. He looked more like a beast trying to disguise himself as a man than an actual man. I thought my life was over as he leaned toward me with his evil eyes glowing and bared his fangs. I closed my eyes knowing the end was near, wishing that I listened to my mother. All of a sudden I heard a loud thump and opened my eyes. My mother was standing over the top of the vampire with a shovel gripped in her hands. She screamed, "Let go of my son, you monster!" The blow had hit the vampire in the head, and since she had caught him off guard, it knocked the monster off of me long enough for me to get up. "Wow," Colt said admiringly. "Your mom is awesome." Yes, she was," Accio said sorrowfully. Colt knew what Accio meant when he said was, and hoped he hadn't upset him. Accio continued with his story. My mother screamed for me to run. Then she raised the shovel and began yelling for help as she swung it repeatedly at the vampire. I took off running as fast as I could. I ran and ran before I finally turned to see if my mother was following. But she wasn't. The beast was on top of her with his head buried in her neck. I had seen his fangs. I knew what he was, and I knew what he was doing to her. I wanted to run back and help her, but I couldn't. I was frozen with fear. I forced myself to take a few steps closer before I collapsed to my knees and cried. Akio's eyes watered as he said, I stood there and did nothing. You were just a kid, Colt said in an attempt to comfort him. I know, and I also know that I would have been killed if I had gone closer, but I still should have tried. He took a deep breath in and released it slowly, then said, almost to himself, I am forever shamed by my cowardice. Colt looked up at him, wanting to comfort him, but not knowing the right thing to say. The last thing I saw was some people from my village running out after the creature as he dragged my mother off into the darkness. That was the last time I saw my mother, my home, and my friends. I ran away to live my shamed life alone. I spent the next few years living on the streets. Colt nodded in understanding. He knew just how that felt. Living on the streets stinks, he thought. During my time alone, I decided that I was going to learn to kill those creatures, and I wouldn't rest until the beast that killed my mother was dead. The idea seemed heroic to me at the time. It was really just a desperate attempt to help myself to feel less ashamed, but it wasn't something that ever seemed realistically possible. At least, that's what I thought, until something happened that changed my life forever. What? What was it? Colt asked, urging him on, caught up in the story. I was kidnapped and taken from the streets when I was 10 by a ninja that I knew only as the Gatherer. Colt looked at Akio in amazement as he began to explain. As I told you before, the Emperor of Japan had lost his power and was very unhappy about it. He recruited and funded a special clan of ninjas that would devote their lives to help him regain his power. The Emperor knew that his power couldn't be taken back by force. He would have to take it back through fear, intimidation, and some key assassinations of government officials. But that's another story. Now where was I? You were taken by the Gatherer, Master, Crimson said respectfully. Oh yes. Thank you, Crimson. Crimson bowed his head, acknowledging his master's thanks. The clan was strong in their abilities, but weak in number, so they snatched the most resourceful children from the streets and put them through trials. Any children who survived were trained as the Emperor's assassins. Each was bound to the clan for life. Akio rolled up his sleeve and showed Colt the tattoo of a peregrine falcon on his forearm. The falcon flew just above a Japanese flag that was firmly grasped in its talons. The falcon is the Emperor's crest, Akio said as he pointed at the tattoo, and the grasping of the flag represents recapturing control of the country. Cool, Colt said as he stared at the markings on the old man's arm. I wanted their training so I'd become strong enough to kill vampires. I spent the next 15 years being trained as a member of the Hayabusa clan until I was finally promoted as the clan's top assassin and was awarded my master's sword. He drew the long curved blade from the sheath at his side. Firelight glinted off the polished steel as he showed the boys the falcon engraved on the hilt. But I had forgotten while I was really there. I was supposed to let them train me, and then when I was good enough I was going to find a way to escape. But somewhere throughout my time living there I forgot who I was and why I was there. I never wanted to kill anyone, only those evil creatures, but eventually their training and manipulation turned me into the perfect killer. I was lost and I didn't even know it. It wasn't until my most important mission that I finally realized. A knock came at the door, interrupting Akio's story. Ah, that will be my other students. Colt let out a sigh of frustration at the interruption. He wanted to know what happened next. Come in, he shouted. The door swung open and there stood two more teenagers, a stocky young man and a beautiful green-eyed girl. Colt felt his heart stop in his chest as he sprang to his feet. Sandy, he gasped as he flew to the door and threw his arms around her. I knew it. I knew you were alive. Where's Candy? The girl stepped back quickly, looking at him in confusion. You know this girl? Akio asked in amazement. Yes. Yes, Colt said, not taking his eyes off of her. This is my sister. The girl's confusion slowly changed to excitement as she stared intently at Colt. Colt? Is that you? She said in astonishment. Is it really you? Yes, Sandy, it's me. I've been looking everywhere for you. And you found me, he said, smiling and hugging her again. She smiled and hugged him back tightly. Akio came to her side and said, Sandy, is that your name? Do you remember? Colt looked at Akio in confusion, unsure of what was going on. Yes, she said excitedly. My name is Sandy Cantrell. I remember. What's going on, Sandy? Colt asked. Accio answered him. We found her about a year ago. It was in this very cabin, as a matter of fact. When we found her, she didn't know who she was or what had happened to her. She's been living and training with us ever since. Oh, no, Sandy cried, looking horrified. I remember everything.